I remember the exact moment my own family erased me, like I was never part of their story at all. My mom stood there at the head of the table, smiling proudly, and said my brother built everything on his own, not a single handout, and everyone clapped like it was some kind of achievement, while I just sat there staring at my plate because I knew every word of that was a lie. I had been the one quietly holding his life together for years, and not one person at that table even looked at me. Not one person questioned it. And in that moment, it didn't just feel unfair. It felt like betrayal. Like I had been written out of my own family while they all watched it happen and smiled. And the worst part was my brother didn't say a word. He just let them believe it. Let them praise him, like I didn't exist. And I realized right then something was very wrong. Not just with what they were saying, but with what they were hiding. And before I go any further, if this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe. And I'd really love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country and your local time in the comments. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 37 years old. And that dinner was the night everything in my family finally broke. But to understand why that moment hit so hard, you have to go back to where it all started. Because none of this happened overnight. It built slowly, quietly, in ways that didn't seem like a big deal at first. I mean, growing up, Jason was always the golden one, the one everyone talked about, the one who could do no wrong, and I didn't really mind back then. I had my own path. I joined the military. I kept my head down. I built my life on discipline and routine, and for a long time I told myself that was enough. But every time I came home, I started noticing little things, small comments. The way my mom would praise Jason for things that didn't quite add up. The way conversations would shift whenever money came up. Like there was something they didn't want to say out loud. And at first I ignored it, because honestly, I didn't want to believe anything was off. I didn't want to question my own family. But the truth is, there were moments that didn't make sense, like how Jason suddenly had a nice apartment downtown when I knew he'd been struggling just months before, or how he talked about his business like it just magically worked out. No stress. No setbacks. No details. And every time I tried to ask something simple, my mom would jump in and answer for him, like she was protecting something or someone. And I remember thinking maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I just hadn't been around enough to see the full picture. But deep down I had this feeling I couldn't shake, like there was a piece of the story missing. And the more I paid attention, the more obvious it became that I wasn't just missing something, I was being left out on purpose. And what I didn't realize back then was that the truth wasn't just being hidden from me, it was being rewritten, right in front of me. And by the time that dinner happened, by the time they all clapped for him, the lie had already gone too far to ignore. Growing up in our house, things were never loud or obviously unfair. It was quieter than that, more subtle. The kind of imbalance you only notice when you start paying attention. Jason always got the bigger piece of everything. Not just food or gifts, but attention, patience, forgiveness. I remember one Christmas when I was about 10, I got a pair of practical winter boots because mine had worn out, and Jason got a brand new gaming console that he had casually mentioned once. My mom hugged him like he had achieved something, like he deserved it. And when I asked about it later, she just said, "He needs things that motivate him." Like that explained everything. And I told myself it was fine, because I was the easy kid, the one who did not ask for much, the one who figured things out on her own. And that became my role without anyone ever saying it out loud. I handled my own problems, my own school, my own path, while Jason was always supported, even when he failed, especially when he failed. I remember when he dropped out of community college after one semester. My dad barely reacted, just nodded and said, "He will find his way." But when I mentioned enlisting in the military, my mom cried for days, saying I was making my life harder than it needed to be. And I did not understand that back then. I thought maybe she was just worried. But looking back now, I realize it was because I was stepping outside the role they had for me, the one where I quietly held everything together without asking for anything in return. and the pattern only got clearer as we got older. When Jason moved out, there were always small emergencies. His car broke down, his rent was short, something always came up, and somehow it was always solved. I never saw the full picture at the time, just pieces, like overhearing my mom whispering on the phone late at night, or my dad saying, "Do not worry, we will handle it." But when I moved out and started building my own life, those little pieces started connecting, because suddenly I was the one getting calls, not directly, never directly, but through my mom, through guilt, through family needs help, and it started small, just a few $100s here and there, nothing that felt like a big deal. I had a steady income, I was disciplined, I could manage it, and every time I helped, I told myself it was temporary, just until Jason got back on his feet, just until things stabilized. But they never really did. There was always another reason, another situation, another quiet transfer that no one talked about, and what bothered me the most was not even the money, it was how normal it became for them, how expected it was. Like I was just part of the system that kept Jason afloat. And yet, whenever I visited, none of it was acknowledged. Not even a simple thank you. Instead, I would hear things like, "Jason has been working so hard lately," or, "He is really turning things around." And I would sit there listening, nodding, saying nothing, because I did not want to make it about me. I did not want to create tension. But there was this moment, a small one, that stuck with me more than anything else. It was a random Sunday afternoon. I was home on leave, and Jason was talking about his new apartment, how he managed to secure it in a great neighborhood, and my mom smiled and said, "See, when you believe in yourself, things work out." And I remember looking at him, waiting for him to say something, anything, even just a glance in my direction, but he did not, he just kept talking. Like the story they were telling was the only version that existed, and that was the first time I felt it clearly. Not just imbalance, not just favoritism, but something deeper, something intentional, like the truth was being quietly rewritten, and I was the only one who knew what had really happened, and I started to wonder how long that had been going on without me noticing. I think the moment everything really started to shift was not loud or dramatic at first. It was actually the opposite. It was quiet. Almost easy to miss if you were not paying attention. It happened the year I got promoted. I had been in the military for over a decade by then, working long hours, moving bases, doing everything by the book, and when that promotion finally came through, it felt like proof that all of it meant something. I remember standing there in uniform, my name being called, my hands steady even though my chest felt tight, and for the first time in a long time I thought maybe I had finally built something of my own that no one could take away or ignore. I called home that night, not expecting much, just wanting to share it. My mom picked up, and I told her, and there was a pause, just a second too long, before she said, "That is nice, honey. We are proud of you." But her tone felt distant, like she was distracted, and then almost immediately she shifted the conversation to Jason, telling me about how his business was starting to take off, how he was finally doing something meaningful, and I remember standing there in my kitchen, still in uniform, realizing that even in that moment, even when I had something real to share, it still was not enough to hold their attention, and that was when I started pulling back emotionally, not in a dramatic way, just small things. Calling less, sharing less, keeping more to myself. But at the same time, something else was happening. Something I did not fully understand yet. Because around that same period, Jason started reaching out to me more directly, not through my mom, but to me, texting late at night, calling when things got complicated, and at first it felt different. Like maybe we were finally building some kind of real sibling relationship. He would say things like, "I just need a little help to get through this month," or, "This is the last time, I promise." And I believed him, or at least I wanted to, because part of me still hoped that if I showed up for him, if I supported him enough, things might feel more balanced, more honest. And those first few times did not feel like a big deal, a couple $100, maybe 1,000, once when he said he had a major opportunity he could not miss. And I told myself it was temporary, just like before, but this time it felt more direct, more personal, like I was part of something he was building, and for a while, it even felt good, like I was finally being included instead of watching from the outside. But then I started noticing patterns again, the same ones from before. The vague explanations, the way he avoided specifics, the way he always framed things like they were just about to turn around. And I would ask simple questions, nothing aggressive, just trying to understand, and he would laugh it off or change the subject. And slowly, that feeling of connection started to shift into something else, something heavier, because the more I helped, the more I realized I was not actually being brought in. I was just being relied on, quietly, consistently, and still, no one talked about it. Not him, not my parents, not anyone. And then there was this one call late at night where his voice sounded different, more urgent than usual, and what he asked me that night made me pause in a way I had not before, because it was not small anymore. It was not temporary anymore. And I remember staring at my phone after he said it, thinking that if I said yes, something would change, and if I said no, something would break, and I had no idea yet just how much that one decision was going to matter. That night on the phone, he did not ease into it the way he usually did. There was no small talk, no attempt to soften the ask. He just said it straight. I need $6,500 by the end of the week or I lose everything. And I remember going quiet because something about the way he said everything felt rehearsed. Like he had practiced it. Like he already knew exactly how I would react. And when I asked what it was for, he gave me the same vague explanation. Something about securing a contract, keeping his business afloat, just one more push before things finally stabilized, and I could hear the pressure in his voice, but I could also hear something else. Something that did not feel like panic. It felt controlled. Like he was guiding the conversation toward a yes, and then he said, "You are the only one I can count on." And that line stayed with me longer than anything else, because it sounded less like trust and more like expectation. But I still said yes. Not right away. I hesitated. I asked a few more questions. But in the end, I said yes, because that is what I had always done. I showed up. I handled it. I made sure things did not fall apart. And within 2 days, I wired the money. I remember staring at the confirmation screen. And unease. Like I had just crossed a line I did not fully understand yet. And after that, things changed. Not all at once, but enough for me to notice. Jason stopped sounding stressed when we talked. His tone shifted. Lighter. Almost confident. And when I asked how things were going, he would say things like, "It is all coming together," or, "You will see soon." But he never gave details, never explained where the money actually went. And I started hearing about his success from other people. Before I heard it from him, my mom would call and tell me how proud she was of him, how he was building something from the ground up, how he was finally proving everyone wrong. And each time she said it, there was this quiet assumption in her voice, like none of it had anything to do with me, like the support I gave was invisible, and I tried to brush it off at first. I told myself it did not matter who got the credit as long as things were working out. But then the story started getting bigger, more polished, more complete, and that is when it stopped feeling like an oversight and started feeling like something else entirely, because Jason was not just omitting the truth, he was replacing it, telling people he had built everything on his own, that he had struggled but never relied on anyone. And what shocked me the most was not that he said it, it was that everyone believed him. My parents repeated it, our relatives repeated it. Even people outside the family started seeing him that way, as this self-made success story. And I would sit there listening, waiting for someone to question it, waiting for even a small acknowledgement of what had actually happened. But it never came, and the more the story spread, the more solid it became, like it was being locked into place. And every time I thought about speaking up, something held me back. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was the fear of creating conflict, Or maybe it was the part of me that still wanted to believe they would eventually recognize the truth on their own, the one that changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering, nothing special, just everyone together after I'd been away for a while. And at first it felt normal, casual conversation, familiar routines, but there was this underlying energy I could not quite place. Like something had already been decided before I even walked in. And then my mom stood up, smiling in a way that felt too rehearsed, raised her glass, and said those words about Jason building everything on his own, and when the room filled with applause. That was the moment it all collapsed for me. Not just the illusion, but the trust, the connection, everything I thought we still had. Because in that moment, it was clear that the lie was no longer accidental. It was accepted. It was celebrated. And I was completely erased from it. The silence after that applause did not last long. But something inside me stayed quiet in a way I could not shake. I did not argue. I did not correct anyone at the table. I just sat there, finished dinner like nothing happened, and left earlier than I planned. And the moment I got into my car, I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out if I had somehow misunderstood it all, if maybe I had expected too much. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision they had all made. And I was not part of it, so I tried to fix it, not in a dramatic way, just in the way I always handled things, calmly, directly. I called my mom the next morning, and when she answered, she sounded normal, like nothing unusual had happened the night before. And I said, "Can we talk about dinner?" And there was a pause, just a small one, before she said, "What about it?" Like she genuinely did not see a problem. And I explained carefully, not accusing, just stating facts, reminding her about the money I had sent, about the support I had given, and she listened, but not in a way that felt open, more like she was waiting for me to finish. And then she said, "Emily, that is different. That is just family, helping family. It does not count." And that sentence stayed with me because it erased everything so easily, like years of support were just background noise. And I tried again. I said, "But you said he did everything on his own." And she replied, "He did. You just helped a little along the way." And I realized then that in her version of the story, what I had done was too small to matter, no matter how much it actually was. And when I brought up the exact amount, the $6,500, she got quiet again and then said, "Why are you keeping track like that? That is not what family does." And the conversation ended there, not with a resolution, just with distance. And after that, I reached out to Jason directly. I texted him first, something simple. "Can we talk about what Mom said last night?" And he did not respond for hours, which was unusual for him. And when he finally did, it was just, "You are overthinking it." Nothing more, no explanation, no acknowledgement, and I called him after that, because texting did not feel like enough. And when he answered, his tone was different. Not defensive exactly, but guarded. And I asked him directly, "Why did you let her say that?" And he laughed, like it was not serious, like I was making it bigger than it needed to be, and he said, "It is just how she talks, you know that." And I said, "But it is not true." And there was a pause, longer this time, before he said, "It is not that simple." And I waited for him to explain, to say something real, but he did not. He just repeated, "You are making this a bigger deal than it is." And that was the moment I realized he was not going to fix it either. He was not going to correct the story. Not because he could not, but because he did not want to. And I even tried one last time. I sent him a message later that night, longer this time, laying everything out clearly, the timeline, the transfers, the reasons, not in a confrontational way, just facts, hoping that seeing it all written out would make him respond differently, but he never replied. Not that night, not the next day, not at all. And a few days later, I saw a post online, a photo of him standing in front of his office, smiling, with a caption about building success from nothing, and there were comments, people congratulating him, calling him inspiring, and my mom had shared it with a message about how proud she was of her self-made son, and I just stared at the screen for a long time, not angry, not even surprised anymore. Just empty. Because it was clear then that there was no fixing this. No conversation that was going to change it. The story was already set, and I was completely outside of it, like I had never been part of it at all. After that, things did not explode the way you might expect. There was no big fight, no dramatic confrontation. Just silence. A kind of quiet distance that slowly settled into every part of my life, and it felt heavier than any argument could have, because it meant there was nothing left to fix. I stopped calling as often, and when I did, the conversations were short, surface level, like we were all pretending everything was normal while carefully avoiding anything real. My mom would talk about the weather, about neighbors, about small things that did not matter. And she never once brought up that dinner again. Not even indirectly. And I stopped bringing it up too, not because I was over it, but because I finally understood that there was no version of that conversation where I would be heard. And with Jason, it was even more distant. He stopped reaching out altogether. No more late-night calls. No more messages asking for help. And at first that should have felt like relief, like I was finally free from that cycle. But instead it felt like something had been cut off without warning. Like a door had been closed and locked without explanation, and I kept checking my phone out of habit, expecting something, anything. But nothing came. And then I started noticing something else. The practical side of it. The things I had been handling without even thinking about it. The automatic payments, the quiet support that had become routine. I would log into my accounts and see the scheduled transfers, the recurring charges tied to his life. And for the first time, I hesitated before approving them, not out of anger, just awareness. Like I was finally seeing the full weight of what I had been carrying, and I realized how much of, even just mentally, it left this empty space I did not know how to fill, because for years, being needed had been part of my identity, part of how I understood my place in my family, and without that I felt disconnected, not just from them, but from myself. And there were nights where I would sit in my apartment, everything quiet, no calls, no messages, no emergencies to solve, and instead of feeling peaceful, it felt unfamiliar, like I had been removed from something without being told why, and I started questioning things I had never questioned before. Not just what they had done, but why I had accepted it for so long. Why I had kept showing up without asking for anything in return. And those questions did not have easy answers. They just stayed there, sitting in the background of everything I did. And for a while, I let that silence continue. I did not push. I did not reach out again. I just focused on my work, on my routine, on things that were clear and structured, and did not shift depending on someone else's version of the truth. And slowly, almost without realizing it, something started to change. Not in them, but in me. It was small at first. Just a different way of thinking when I looked at those payments. A pause before saying yes to something I used to agree to automatically. A quiet realization that I had a choice. And that maybe, for the first time, I could decide what happened next. After that shift, I stopped waiting for something to change on their side and started adjusting things on mine. Not in a big dramatic way, just small, consistent decisions that added up over time. I canceled the automatic transfers one by one. Not out of anger, just because I realized they were never meant to be permanent. I updated my accounts, removed shared access, and for the first time in years, my finances were completely my own. No hidden responsibilities, no silente obligation, and it felt strange at first. Almost like I had forgotten how to manage a life that only belonged to me. But I leaned into that. I focused on my work, on my schedule, on the structure that had always grounded me. Early mornings, long hours, clear expectations, things that made sense, things that did not shift depending on someone else's narrative. And slowly, I started noticing the difference. I had more time, more energy, more clarity. I was not constantly anticipating the next call, the next request. the next problem to solve. And instead, I started investing that energy into myself. I signed up for additional training, something I had put off for years because I never felt like I had the bandwidth. I took on more responsibility at work, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And for the first time, it felt like forward movement that was entirely mine, not something I was supporting from the background. And outside of work, I made small changes too. I reconnected with people I had not spoken to in a while, friends who knew me for who I was, not for what I provided. I spent weekends doing things that had nothing to do with fixing someone else's situation, simple things like hiking, reading, just being present in my own life, without that constant underlying pressure. And the more I did that, the more I realized how much I had been missing without even knowing it. It was not loud or dramatic, it was steady, quiet, like rebuilding something piece by piece. And there were still moments where I thought about my family, about how easily they had accepted that version of the story, about how quickly I had been removed from it, but those thoughts did not hit the same way anymore. They felt distant, like something I had already stepped away from. And what surprised me the most was how natural it started to feel. Not being part of that system, not being the one who held everything together. It stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like space, like something had been cleared out to make room for something else. And over time, that space filled with things that actually belonged to me, my work, my choices, my direction. And there was a moment, a small one, where I realized I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was moving forward without it. And that was when I knew things were going to be different, not just in the short term, but in a way that would last. Because for the first time, whatever came next was not going to depend on anyone else. It did not happen overnight. But there came a point where the work I had been putting in started to show in ways that were impossible to ignore. I was no longer just keeping up. I was leading, making decisions that affected entire teams, entire operations, and for the first time, people were looking to me not for quiet support, but for direction. I remember the day I stepped into my new role, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my uniform, the weight of it feeling different than before. Not heavier, just more earned. My name stitched clearly across my chest, my rank no longer something I had to explain or prove. It spoke for itself. And when I walked into that building, people greeted me with a kind of respect I had never experienced growing up. Not because of what I gave them, but because of what I had built, what I had become. And there was this moment during a briefing, nothing dramatic, just a room full of people listening as I spoke, taking notes, asking questions, trusting my judgment, and I realized I was not second-guessing myself anymore. I was not shrinking to make space for someone else. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And that feeling stayed with me, even outside of work. It showed up in the way I carried myself, the way I made decisions, the way I no longer hesitated to choose what was right for me without needing approval. And it was not about proving anything to my family anymore. It was not about correcting the story they had created. It was about living in a reality that was grounded, consistent, and real. Something no one else could rewrite. And over time, the distance between that life and the one I had left behind became clearer, almost like looking at two completely different versions of myself. One who was constantly adjusting, accommodating, staying quiet, and one who had finally stepped into her own space without apology, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. And then, one afternoon, weeks after I had fully settled into this new rhythm, my phone lit up with a name I had not seen in a while, and for a second I just stared at it, because it felt like a connection to something I had already moved past, something I had deliberately stepped away from. And I knew before I even answered that whatever was on the other end of that call was not going to fit into the life I had built now. And yet, it was still part of my story. Something unfinished, something that had been left hanging back at that dinner table, waiting for a moment like this to come back around. The name on my phone was Jason, and for a moment I just let it ring. Not because I was unsure, but because I already knew the tone of that call before I even answered. When I finally picked up, there was no greeting, just a pause. And then his voice. Lower than I remembered, less confident. He said my name like he was testing it, like he was not sure how I would respond anymore. And I did not say much, just, "What is going on?" And there was another pause, longer this time, and then he said, "Can you come by tonight?" No explanation, no details, just that, and something in the way he said it felt different from before, not like the controlled urgency he used to have. This was quieter, heavier, like whatever he was dealing with was no longer something he could talk around. And I should have said no. Everything in me knew I had already stepped away from that part of my life. But instead I said yes, not out of habit, just curiosity, like there was something unfinished that I needed to see for myself. And when I got there, the house felt different. It looked the same from the outside. But inside it was quieter, the kind of quiet that does not feel calm, just empty. My mom was in the kitchen, moving slowly, like she had been standing there for a while. And when she saw me, she gave a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said, "I am glad you came," like we had not gone weeks without speaking, like nothing had changed, and I nodded, not trusting myself to say much yet. And then I saw Jason sitting at the table, not looking at his phone, not talking, just sitting there with his hands folded, and that alone told me more than anything else, because he had never been still like that before, and the room felt tense in a way that was hard to explain, like everyone knew something but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And I took a seat across from him, the same place I had sat that night, and for a second, it felt like everything was looping back to that moment, like this was where it had all started to break, and now we were back here again. Except this time, no one was smiling, no one was celebrating, and I could feel it building. That same pressure, that same unspoken tension, but heavier now, because whatever story they had been telling before, it was not holding up anymore. And my mom finally spoke. Her voice softer than usual, she said, "We need to talk about some things." And I looked at Jason, waiting, not pushing, just waiting. Because for the first time, it felt like they were the ones trying to catch up to something I had already moved past. And then he finally looked up, and in that moment, I could see it. The shift, the crack in everything they had built. And I knew whatever he was about to say was going to change the story again. Just not in the way they expected. Jason did not look away this time. He just sat there, his hands still folded like he was trying to hold something together that was already slipping. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but low. He said, "Things did not go the way I said they did." And my mom shifted in her seat immediately, like she wanted to interrupt, but he kept going. "The business, it never really stabilized." And there was a pause, not dramatic, just long enough for the words to settle, and I did not say anything. I just watched. Because for the first time, he was not controlling the narrative. He was catching up to it. And my mom tried to step in, her voice tight. "Jason, we do not need to go into all of that." But he shook his head slightly and said, "No, we do." And then he looked at me, not directly, more like in my direction, and said, "I could not keep it running without help." And he stopped there. Like even now he was struggling to say it clearly. And I leaned back in my chair, not reacting, just letting the silence stretch a little longer, and then I said calmly, "Without my help." And that was the first time the words were actually spoken out loud in that room, and it changed the air instantly. My mom looked at me, then at him, like she was trying to decide which version of the story to hold on to, and he did not argue. He just nodded once, slow, almost reluctant. And my dad, who had been quiet the entire time, finally spoke. "How much?" And Jason hesitated. And that hesitation said more than any number could. And I answered before he could. Not sharply, just clearly. 6,500 at one point, plus everything else before that, and my mom's expression shifted, not disbelief. More like discomfort, like she was being forced to look at something she had chosen to ignore, and she said, "Emily, that is not fair. You are making it sound like—" And I cut in. not raising my voice, just finishing the thought. Like he did not do it on his own. And she stopped talking, because there was nothing to argue with in that sentence. It was not an accusation, it was just the truth. And the room went quiet again. But this time it felt different. Not tense in the same way. More like something had finally been placed where it belonged. And Jason rubbed his hands together, looking down at the table and said, "I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." And I nodded slightly, because that part made sense. Not as an excuse, just as a reality. And my dad leaned back, exhaling slowly, like he was recalculating everything he thought he knew. And my mom, she just sat there, her expression somewhere between defensive and uncertain, and she said, softer now, "We did not know." And I looked at her for a second before answering. "You did not ask." And that landed harder than anything else I had said. Not because it was harsh, but because it was simple, and there was no way around it. And for the first time, no one tried to correct me. No one tried to reshape the story. They just sat with it. And that was when I realized something had shifted completely, not just in what they knew, but in how they saw me, because I was not the quiet one at the table anymore, not the one who stayed out of the story. I was the one who had been holding it together the entire time, and now that it was out in the open, there was no way to put it back the way it was. And the look on my mom's face, the way she avoided my eyes, that was the moment it hit her. Not just what had happened, but who I had become without them. And it left her with something she could not easily fix or ignore anymore. No one spoke for a while after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. And none of it fit the version of the family they were used to pretending we were. My mom was the first to move. She stood up slowly, like she needed something to do with her hands, and started clearing plates that were already clean, avoiding eye contact. And she said, "We did what we thought was best." Not looking at me, more like she was saying it to the room, and I did not respond right away. Because I knew that sentence was not about understanding. It was about justification. And my dad leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table, his voice quieter than usual. "Why did you not tell us?" And I looked at him for a second before answering. "I tried." And he nodded. But it was the kind of nod that comes too late, like he was acknowledging something after it no longer mattered. And Jason stayed quiet, his posture still closed, like he was shrinking into the space he had created. And my mom turned back toward me, her expression tighter now, defensive again. "You could have said something sooner, Emily, instead of letting it get to this point." And that was the moment I realized she still did not fully see it. She still thought this was about timing, about communication, not about what had actually been done. And I said calmly, "I did say something, you just decided it did not count." And that landed in a way that made her stop moving completely, like she had run out of ways to reframe it, and the room settled into that quiet again. But this time it felt different, less tense, more final, like something had been decided without needing to be announced. And I stood up then, not abruptly, just naturally, like the conversation had reached its end for me. And my mom looked at me, finally meeting my eyes, and said, "So what happens now?" And there was something in her voice. Not quite an apology, not quite a demand, more like uncertainty. And I paused for a moment before answering, because this was the part that mattered, not what had already happened, but what came next. And I said, "Now things stay the way they are." And she frowned slightly, like she was not sure what that meant. And I continued, "I am not part of that system anymore." And I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because the weight of that sentence was clear. And Jason finally looked up again, his expression somewhere between realization and frustration. "So that is it? You are just done?" And I met his gaze this time, steady, not angry, just certain. "I am not fixing anything that is not mine anymore." And that was the closest thing to a boundary I had ever said out loud in that house, and no one argued with it. Not because they agreed, but because they did not have anything solid to push back with, and my dad exhaled slowly, leaning back again, like he was processing a version of me he had not seen before, and my mom looked like she wanted to say more, like she was searching for something that could pull things back to how they were, but there was nothing left to reach for. And I picked up my keys, not in a rushed way, just part of the motion of leaving. And for a second, I stood there, taking in the room, the same table, the same chairs, the same people, but it felt completely different now. Like the structure was still there, but whatever held it together had shifted, and as I walked toward the door, my mom said my name. Softer this time. And I stopped, not turning around yet, just waiting. And she said, "We are still your family." And I let that sit for a second before answering. That has never been the question. And I stepped outside after that. The air cooler than I expected. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something important. This was not the kind of moment that fixed everything or broke everything completely. It was something in between. Something unresolved. And I could feel that even as I walked away, because part of it was still there, not pulling me back, but not fully gone either. Like a story that had finally been told out loud, but not fully finished yet. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that night. There was no dramatic resolution where everyone apologized and everything went back to the way it used to be, but something did settle into place in a way that felt real. Something quieter, steadier. I went back to my routine, back to work, back to the structure that had always grounded me. But this time it felt different, not like I was escaping something, more like I was returning to myself. There were still moments when I thought about my family, about that table, about everything that had been said and everything that had not, but those thoughts no longer carried the same weight. They felt like something I had already faced, already understood. And slowly, over time, the distance between us became clearer, not harsh, not bitter, just honest. I spoke to them occasionally, short conversations, careful ones, and that was enough, because for the first time, I was not trying to fill a role that did not belong to me anymore. And Jason, he figured things out in his own way. Not quickly, not easily, but without me stepping in, and that was something he had to face on his own, something I could not carry for him anymore. And there was a day, a simple one, nothing dramatic, where I stood in my apartment after a long day, still in uniform, my name stitched across my chest, and I caught my reflection in the mirror. And for a moment, I just stood there, not analyzing, not questioning, just seeing myself clearly. And I realized that for years, I had measured my value by how much I could hold together for other people, how much I could fix, how much I could give without asking anything back. But that night at the table, and everything that followed, showed me something I had been avoiding for a long time. That if people can build a story without you, they can also take from you without ever seeing it as something that matters. And that is where boundaries begin. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in clarity. In understanding what is yours to carry and what is not. And if you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you have ever felt invisible in your own story, like your effort, your support, your presence did not count, I want you to know that it is not your job to prove your worth by sacrificing yourself over and over again. Your value is not defined by how much you give to people who refuse to acknowledge it. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is step back and let the truth stand on its own, even if it changes everything, and maybe that is where faith comes in. Whether you believe in God, or something greater, or just your own intuition, there is a quiet voice that tells you when something is not right, and learning to trust that voice might be the hardest but most important thing you ever do, because it will guide you back to yourself when everything else feels unclear. So protect what you have built. Protect your time, your energy, your peace, because those things are not endless. And once you see their value, you cannot pretend not to anymore. My name is Emily Carter. I am 37 years old. And the lesson I carry with me is simple. Do not let anyone rewrite your role in your own life. And if this story stayed with you in any way, If it made you think about your own experiences, feel free to share where you are watching from or what part resonated with you. You are not as alone as you think, and there are more stories like this, more moments, more lessons waiting for you in the next videos, so if you are ready, take that step and keep going. Because sometimes the story that helps you heal is the one you have not heard yet.